Today, the bus seems like one of the most ordinary things in a city. It pulls into stops on schedule, follows fixed routes, and carries workers, students, patients, and people heading home from one stop to another. It is not especially fast, and it is not particularly advanced. Most of the time, it is simply treated as part of the city's default background. But before it appeared, sitting in the same vehicle with strangers was not something people took for granted. At that time, the way people traveled was closely tied to class, status, and social position. What kind of vehicle you rode in, and where you sat inside it, often reflected who you were. By the early 19th century, that began to change. A carriage that had originally been used to transport Bathhouse customers started to place complete strangers into the same shared journey on a regular basis. What it ultimately produced was not just more customers, but a new form of urban transportation. Over time, that form gradually became one of the most basic transport systems in the modern city, and it also changed the way cities organize people, structure time, and accommodate strangers. This is the story of the bus. The story of the bus, or, more accurately, its ancestor, the omnibus, usually begins in Nantes, France. In 1826, a retired officer named Stanislas Baudry was running a bathhouse in Nantes. Because the bathhouse was located far from the city center, it did not attract many customers. To solve that problem, he arranged for a large carriage to shuttle passengers between the city and the bathhouse. This Nantes route is usually regarded as one of the earliest successful examples of the modern omnibus. At first, the vehicle was simply a support service for the bathhouse. But before long, Baudry noticed that many passengers were not boarding in order to bathe. They simply wanted a ride into town, or were using this new form of shared transport for its own sake. That made him realize that what people really needed was not just a shuttle to a particular bathhouse, but a fixed public form of urban transportation open to ordinary people. As for the origin of the name omnibus, the most widely repeated story is that near one of Baudry's stops in Nantes, there was a shop owned by a man named Omnes, with a sign that read, Omnes omnibus. The word omnibus comes from Latin and means for all or for everyone. That turned the sign into a remarkably neat double meaning. It could be read as saying that Omnis's shop served everyone, but it also seemed to define this new kind of public carriage at the same time. Later, people often used this story to explain how the name omnibus became associated with public carriages. Whether that detail is entirely true or not, the meaning of the word itself is clear enough. This was a vehicle meant for everyone. In 1828, Baudry brought this model to Paris and began operating it in a more formal urban public transport system. At that point, the omnibus was no longer just a bathhouse shuttle. It now had fixed routes, fixed fares, and served a much broader public. It was in Paris that the omnibus was truly turned into an urban transport system. From that moment on, the idea of public truly entered wheeled urban transportation for the first time. The success of Paris quickly influenced London. In 1829, George Shillebert brought the omnibus model to London and opened a route running from Paddington to the financial district. Early London omnibuses followed the Parisian pattern. They were large, multi-passenger horse-drawn carriages with wider bodies, and most riders sat inside the cabin. The London version of the bus was already more mature in the way it was operated. The vehicles were better appointed, and the service was more formalized. In order to attract middle and upper-class passengers, newspapers and magazines were provided free of charge inside the carriage for passengers to read during the journey. For urban transport at the time, this was by no means a necessary feature. The conductors were also specially chosen. Early accounts mention that Shuttle initially employed the sons of friends as conductors. These young men had lived in Paris, so they were already familiar with the service style of this new kind of vehicle, and they were also able to speak French with passengers. They wore neat uniforms and behaved politely, which stood in clear contrast to the rough and disorderly service often found on more traditional short-distance carriages of the period. All of this shows that the early bus was not simply solving a transport problem. It was also shaping a more respectable form of urban travel. At the same time, however, it faced many practical constraints. Taxes, the number of wheels, passenger capacity, and road conditions all affected operating costs. In order to carry more people, operators had little choice but to keep modifying the structure of the vehicle. As urban populations grew, ground-level space became increasingly limited, so the bus began to grow upward. At first, passengers were simply allowed to sit on the roof. Later, a narrow rooftop bench known as the knife board appeared. This design became very common in London in the mid to late 19th century. Passengers sat back-to-back along the center of the roof and climbed up and down by way of a narrow ladder. The knife board type appeared in 1847 and later became the standard form of the London horse bus for a long period. By 1881, a more comfortable arrangement known as the garden seat appeared, allowing passengers on the upper deck to finally face forward. From that point on, the double-deck structure gradually stabilized. The London double-decker, familiar to later generations, first developed out of exactly this pressure on urban space. What made the bus truly important was not simply that it made travel more convenient. Its deeper impact was that it changed the way different social classes came into contact with one another in the city. In the early 19th century, the resentment many middle and upper-class passengers felt toward the omnibus was very real. The problem was not only the shaking, the crowding, or the smell inside the carriage. It was also that they could not choose who would be sitting beside them. In a society where class distinctions were clearly defined, the bus placed groups that had previously remained separate into the same enclosed space. Bankers, clerks, craftsmen, servants, women, and children might all find themselves sitting side by side in the same row. The carriage was narrow, the space was tight, and the distance between people was forcibly reduced. This was not a common experience in earlier urban life. Dickens was one of the earliest people to notice this. In his writing, the London omnibus was never just a means of transport. It was more like a swaying wooden box, already packed with passengers, while the conductor still insisted that there was room for one more. Once a new passenger stepped onto the footboard, it became difficult to retreat back into the street. Instead, they were gradually pushed farther inside, forced to find a small place to settle between the shoulders and knees of strangers. There were always a few regular passengers inside, people who boarded at the same stop almost every day, sat in the same place, and talked about the same things. These descriptions were not written simply for comic effect. They showed that the bus was creating a new kind of urban experience. Strangers were forced into close proximity, yet were expected to behave as though they did not exist for one another. People collided with each other in heavy jolts, while still trying to preserve some sense of dignity. This mix of awkwardness, restraint, and silent adjustment gradually became part of modern, urban public life. In that sense, the bus became a new kind of social space. People were not only moving through the city, they were also learning how to coexist with strangers. Different accents, occupations, styles of dress, and ways of life began to appear in one another's field of vision more frequently than before. The bus did not eliminate class, but it changed the way different classes encountered one another in the city. In that sense, it was not just a means of transport. It was also part of the making of modern public space. As the structure of the passenger carriage changed, the power system of the bus also began to change. Before the internal combustion engine became widespread, people in the 19th century were already experimenting with steam-powered buses. As early as the 1830s, Britain had already seen steam buses designed specifically for public passenger service. One of the best-known examples was Enterprise, put into operation by Walter Hancock in 1833. It became an important early representative of mechanically powered bus transport. Steam buses did increase power, but they were large, noisy, and difficult to maintain. In the long run, they were not well suited to becoming the dominant form of transport in major cities. A more practical solution was the horse-drawn streetcar. By 1832, an early horse car line had already appeared on Bowery Street in New York. These vehicles were still pulled by horses, but their wheels no longer ran directly on ordinary roads. Instead, they moved along rails. The rails greatly reduced rolling resistance. With the same two horses, a larger carriage could now be pulled. The ride became smoother, and passenger capacity increased. It did not change the source of power, but it significantly improved the efficiency of horse transport and, for the first time, gave urban public transportation the conditions to expand on a larger scale. But horse-based transport itself soon revealed its limits. By the late 19th century, cities like London had enormous numbers of working horses on the streets every day. This brought with it a whole series of problems: manure removal, street sanitation, feeding costs, and the disposal of dead animals. It was a sign that traditional horse-drawn transport was approaching the limits of what a growing city could sustain. The most visible problem at the time was horse manure. A single working horse could produce around 10 kilograms of manure a day, and in a large city dependent on horse transport, tens of thousands of horses might be working on the streets at the same time. Added together, that meant an astonishing amount of waste had to be dealt with every single day. That is why, by the late 19th century, a popular claim began to circulate: if things continued this way, London might one day be buried under a thick layer of horse manure. That claim was later repeated many times, and it certainly contained some exaggeration, but it still reflected something real. For people at the time, the limits of horse-drawn transport were already impossible to ignore. Against this background, new power technologies began to take over the city streets. The development of electric motors, advances in mechanical engineering, and the growing maturity of internal combustion vehicles gradually brought the age of the horse carriage to an end. By the end of the 19th century, the bus had already begun to enter its mechanical age. By the end of the 19th century, the bus had finally reached a decisive turning point. It was at this stage that the modern public bus truly emerged. In 1895, Germany saw one of the earliest scheduled internal combustion bus routes. In March, an internal combustion bus, delivered by Benz and CIE, began operating between Siegen, Netphen, and Duels. The route was about 15 kilometers long and is often regarded as one of the key starting points of the modern mechanized bus. This vehicle could carry only 8 passengers, had an engine of just 5 horsepower, and reached a top speed of about 20 kilometers per hour. It was neither powerful nor particularly reliable, but it proved for the first time that public transport no longer had to depend on horses and could instead be continuously powered by machinery. Compared with the horse-drawn omnibus, the most important change brought by the internal combustion bus was not simply greater power, but the fact that it freed public transport from the limits of the horse. It depended neither on animal strength nor on rails, which made it easier for routes to extend more flexibly into newly developing areas. From this point on, the bus was no longer just an extension of the public carriage. It was gradually becoming an independent, mechanized form of urban transportation. However, the riding experience of the earliest generation of internal combustion buses was actually quite poor. Tire technology was still immature at the time, and most vehicles used solid rubber tires with very limited shock absorption. Road conditions were also far from ideal. The noise and vibration inside the vehicle were obvious, and in some cases the ride was even less stable than that of a horse-drawn carriage. After the beginning of the 20th century, as the technology gradually matured, The main question for the bus was no longer simply whether it could run, but how it could serve an entire city in a stable way. What was really changing at this stage was not just the vehicle itself, but the whole system around it. Routes, stops, timetables, fares, route numbers, dispatching, maintenance, and depots. All of these things that seem ordinary today were gradually taking shape during this period. One very concrete change was that people were no longer simply waiting for a passing vehicle, but were instead waiting for a fixed route at a fixed place. A London bus map from 1921 already clearly showed route numbers. By that point, the bus was no longer just a moving vehicle on the street. It had begun to exist as a network that could be recognized, planned, and remembered. Before long, even the act of waiting for a bus had itself become standardized. In 1924, London's transport system introduced a new design for the bus stop post. Its importance was not in its appearance, but in the fact that it turned what had once been a vague waiting place into a clearly defined piece of urban infrastructure. From that moment on, the bus was no longer simply moving along roads. It was beginning to leave fixed coordinates within the city. As the bus became a standardized urban facility, it was no longer just a transport business operated by a particular company. It was gradually being incorporated into systems of city management and public service. Vehicle designs became more uniform, body structures more mature, and boarding arrangements more clearly defined. In this process, double-deckers and single-deckers each found their own role. Double-deck buses were well suited to dense trunk routes, where they could increase capacity within limited road space. Single-deck buses, by contrast, were more flexible and better suited to ordinary neighborhoods and branch routes. At the same time, the way people used the bus was also becoming standardized. Passengers gradually became used to waiting at fixed places, identifying routes by number, and boarding and getting off under set fares. The bus began to organize time within the city. It turned questions like when to leave, when to transfer, and when to arrive into something that could be reasonably predicted in everyday life. This was an important step. A modern city is not made up only of buildings and streets. It also depends on a stable order of time. In this sense, the role of the bus was no longer just transportation. It was helping to fix the daily rhythm of the entire city. By the 20th century, competition in urban transportation was becoming more intense. The bus was no longer the only form of public transport. It now had to compete with trams, subways, and later with the rapid rise of the private car. If measured only by speed, the bus was usually not the fastest option. If judged by capacity alone, it could not always compete with subways or heavy rail. And yet, it was never eliminated. The reason was simple. It was flexible enough. That advantage became even more important in the early 20th century. Historically, trams had clearly outperformed buses from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. They carried more passengers, ran more smoothly, and in many major cities they looked more like the future of modern transport. But after the 1920s, the situation began to change. Pneumatic rubber tires gradually became more mature, and paved roads spread across more and more cities. Buses became smoother, more comfortable, and more mechanically reliable. More importantly, they did not require rails. They could open new routes and adjust old ones at lower cost, and they could reach new districts and low-demand areas more easily. By that stage, trams still made sense on dense main corridors, but buses were beginning to show their practical advantages over a much wider range of urban space. That is also why the bus became even more important as cities moved deeper into the age of the automobile. Private cars increased personal mobility, but they also brought congestion, parking pressure, road occupation, and higher energy consumption. By contrast, the bus remained one of the most efficient forms of ground transport in terms of how much movement it could generate within a given amount of road space. It was not the fastest system, nor the most technically sophisticated, but it remained one of the easiest forms of transport to deploy, expand, and use in everyday urban life. Even today, the scale of the system remains enormous. In New York City alone, the MTA still operates 333 bus routes. London today still has more than 19,000 bus stops with a fleet of nearly 800 vehicles. In the Île-de-France region, where Paris is located, the bus network includes around 1,900 routes. These numbers show that the bus has not disappeared from the modern city. It has simply become one of the most ordinary and at the same time one of the largest underlying systems of urban life. Today, the bus seems like one of the most ordinary forms of transportation. Tapping a card to board, stop announcements, transfers, air conditioning, low-floor boarding, and electronic destination signs have all become part of everyday urban life. But what the bus left behind was never just greater travel efficiency. From the shuttle carriage in Nantes to the omnibus systems of Paris and London, from horse-drawn vehicles to the mechanized buses of the steam, electric, and internal combustion age, and then to the mature urban bus networks of the 20th century, its development was never just a series of technical upgrades. It was also part of the way the modern city learned to organize people, roads, time, and space. It changed how the city functioned. Fixed routes, fixed fares, and fixed schedules made it possible, for the first time, to arrange large-scale daily movement in a stable way. It also changed public life in the city. Strangers became used to traveling in the same space, learning to maintain order, politeness, and boundaries within close distance. Even today, the core function of the bus has not changed. Through its fixed routes, it connects people who were once scattered into the daily life of the same city. This is BHE, Brief History of Everything.